In this last lesson in Module 9, we're just going to talk about the concept of global and local variables just a little bit. Now, what is a global and what is a local variable? You can kind of think of them like this. A global variable is a variable that can be accessed from anywhere in your code so that you can change its value anywhere in your code, whereas a local variable only exists in one specific part of your code and not anywhere else. Now, we should probably run through a few examples to help you understand the difference between these two things. And before we run this first example, I just want to say that most programming languages assume that a variable is global until you say it is specifically local. Now that's kind of not great form. We generally want to stay away from global variables for a few reasons. And so what Python does, just like with the indenting, it forces you to assume that all of your variables are local unless you specifically say that they are global. So it just encourages good programming practice. So let's jump in and take a look at our first example. We have this function right here called add1, and all it has in it, it says x plus equals 1. In other words, x is x plus 1 more. And here is our program. It says x is 1, and then our add1 function is called, where it says x plus equals 1, and then it prints x to the screen. Now, theoretically, first guess, you would probably say, all right, well, x, it must print the value of 2 to the screen. But when I run this program, what ends up happening is I get an error. And what it says is local variable x referenced before assignment. In other words, we're trying to add 1 to x, but I don't know what x is. Like, okay, well, let's just fix this problem by passing the x up into this function. Then it'll know what x is, and it'll work out good. Okay, so if I run it now, we can go ahead and run it, and you can see it prints out a 1, which seems kind of strange, right? So x is 1. Then we call our add1 function, and it passes x up into here, and then it says add 1 to x. Okay, so that function's done, and then it prints x to the screen, and x is still 1. It's not a 2 anymore. In fact, we can add 100 to x, and if we run it again, x is still 1. If we set x to 5, by the time we print x, x will still be a 5. So what's going on here? Well, what is actually happening is we're actually passing a copy of x to the function. We're not passing the actual variable x itself. So what happens is x is 5, so we're really just passing the value of x over here. So this x right here is not the same as this x right here. Okay, this x, you can think of it as the x inside our program, our regular program. This x only exists inside this function. As soon as this function is done, this x no longer exists. And that's why it's probably good to generally not have the same variable names inside your functions as you do other places in your code. So for example, this guy could be a y, and it will accomplish the exact same thing. I ran it, it's still a 5, just so you can see it changes. I ran it, it's a 1. So what happens is it passes the value of x up to here, so passed up a 1. So y is 1. We added 100 to y, so y is now 101. And then it comes back down here and it prints x. We in no way changed the value of the x down here because this y, again, like I said, only exists inside our function. This is called a local variable. So as soon as this function is done, this y doesn't exist anymore in our code. And if we tried to print y right here, what would happen is we would get an error. Why? It says, I have no idea what y is. Okay, why doesn't it know what y is? That's because y only exists up in this function. Now we could give y its own value here, like y equals 2, and then it will print a 2 to the screen. And you can see right here, there we go, run it. It prints a 1 and then it prints a 2, and that's just because this y and this y, print knows to pick this y, but otherwise it has no idea what y you're talking about because it can't see inside this function, and when the function's done, that y is gone forever. Now I'm going to bring us back to where we first started. Remember, this gave us an error, so if I run this we get an error. Our function doesn't know what x is. It says, okay, add 1 to x, but I don't have any values for x. Let's say we really desperately wanted to actually change this x's value using that function. Well, we can do that. Now, this is not good programming practice, but the way we do that is we can say global x. And what that means is, it says, okay, go ahead and look outside your function and find the x that you're using in your main program. That is the x that we're trying to talk about. So now when I go ahead and I run this program, what happens is it prints out a 2, which is what we expected the first time, right? So this says x is 1, and then we're calling our function. Our function up here says, go look through the code in your program, go look outside this function for something called x. Take that x and add 1 to it. So that's what this is actually doing. And then now we're going to print x to the screen. And since 1 plus 1 is 2, x now has the value of 2, which is what we expected before. Now again, we generally don't want to use globals. So I'd really encourage you, if you have a function calling that's called add1, a much better way of doing it is just return x plus equals 1. And we would just return x plus 1. We would have to send our value over here, and we say x becomes add 1 to x. So now when we go to run it, we still get that 2. So what happens is x is 1, and then we're calling the function and passing the value of x over here, and we're sending back 1 more than it and putting that, setting x to that value, so x is now 2, and printing it to the screen. So this is a much safer way than just actually accessing the global variable. And one big reason for that is if you can trace your problem back to this line of code, let's say your program is having some sort of issue, it's not doing what you want. If you can trace your problem back to, well, after this line of code, I'm having some weird values, then all you have to do is look at this function. Whereas if you're using globals in all of your functions, you have to go back and look through every single function that you have to see which function is really messing up the global value of x. Another reason that global variables are bad, and I just reset this back to what we had before, is this function can only get used properly with this variable called x somewhere in our program. In other words, we have to only use this function in this program, or we have to have a variable called x, and it will only work with that x. So that makes this function kind of pointless. We can't reuse it on a whole bunch of different variables, right? So it makes it a little less useful to us. And in this example, you can see we've got our add1 function, and we're back to using a local variable called x, and we're sending it back. So we've got, at the start of our program, we've got this x equals 1, and x becomes add1 to x. So we're calling our function x, we're sending back 1 more than it, then we're printing x to the screen. Then we've got this variable called age, which is 16, and age becomes add 1 to our age. Then we're going to print it to the screen. Cost is $13.99, and we're going to add 1 to our cost and print that to the screen. So when I run this program, I end up with 2 because x was 1, and then we added 1 to it, so now x is 2. Age was 16, but we added 1 to it, so now age is 17. Cost is $13.99, and then we added 1 to it, so now our cost is $14.99. So you can see how this function actually can work in multiple different scenarios. We've used this code over and over under different conditions, and it's working really how we want it to work. Whereas if I had global x here, it could only work with this, and it wouldn't work with age, and it wouldn't work with cost either. So as a review, global variables can be accessed anywhere inside or outside of functions, and in general, they're bad. Stay away from them. Local variables are much better. Once the function's over, yes, they tend to just disappear, but they keep your main program's variables much more secure. You're not going to end up with nearly as many runtime errors as if you were using global variables.